Many years, Nate Champion worked as a trail drover, driving cattle from the vast open range to the great Kansas Railroad depots in the early 1880s. Nate took his very hard earned money. He worked for years and set up his own small ranch, his own small spread, deep inside the rich cattle country of Johnson County, Wyoming. Under the Homestead Act, Nate staked out a little place of his own and slowly built up a small herd, fencing in the land with barbed wire in order to protect his property. Now, homesteading was not easy, but Nate was used to hard work. There was just one problem, a little fly in the ointment. Rumors had begun to circulate that Nate Champion was the leader of a gang of rustlers known as the Red Sash Gang. It was indeed a fact that Nate wore a bold crimson-red sash around his waist. But a lot of homesteaders did that. It was just a habit that he picked up from the Mexican vaqueros, the Mexican cowboys, who drifted north in order to work the cattle herds. Nate had never been involved in any such rustler gang, Red Sash or no. The Red Sashers were said to have stolen thousands of cattle with the long rope, lassoing unbranded cattle and taking them from the herds, the big herds. The stolen cattle belonged to the great cattle barons of Johnson County, whose huge ranches controlled vast amounts of unfenced grazing land. Almost all of these mega wealthy and politically powerful cattlemen were absentee owners. Most of them lived in far-off Cheyenne, where they visited the brothels and spent most of their time at the exclusive Cheyenne Social Club. Now, these mega wealthy cattle barons their fear is that the homesteaders and settlers would fence in the open range with the barbed wire. The cattle barons decided to organize themselves against the homesteaders and the settlers, establishing the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. The association's first order of business was to hire ranged detectives to look into the homesteader problem. These ranged detectives became known as the regulators. Not too long afterwards, the regulators turned up at the shack of a woman named Ella Watson. Ella was also known as Cattle Kate, and the association claimed that Ella was a prostitute who sometimes accepted rustled cattle as a payment for her sexual services. Her partner was a man I mentioned earlier, Jim Averill, who also happens to be her husband. Averill he was Cornell University educated and had become the spokesman for the homesteaders, using his vast intellect to fight the cattle barons. The regulators took Kate and Jim and strung them up. Now, at first, it's only to scare them into submission. But as Kate and Jim begin to dance in the air, none of the regulators make a move to cut them down. They let them choke to death. Now, after the deadly deed is done, the Stockmen Association circulates stories and pamphlets saying that Kate, who's actually Ella Watson, was the queen of the cattle rustlers, and that her husband, Jim Averill, was the right-hand man of the rustlers. The stories and flyers link them both to this fictional Red Sash Gang. The press soon followed suit with their own tall tales. For example, the Cheyenne Weekly, of course in bold headlines, screamed that Kate had been looting the range for years, that it was time for all good men to take up arms and to take the law into their own hands. The Cattlemen Association was so pleased with the regulators. They're so pleased with their cattle Kate final solution, extermination, that members of the stock growers decide to make a list, a death list. A death list of all the association's troublemakers. This list of prospective victims was then sent to the association's executive committee. The executive committee is a type of medieval star chamber of mega wealthy ranchers. They make the final selection, deciding on who will live and who will die. They also pump up the propaganda about the Red Sash Gang, claiming it was a damn big organization. Now, under the leadership of Colonel Frank Wolcott and a psycho killer, a very racist psycho killer named Frank Canton, a group of 50 regulators and about a dozen Pinkerton detectives are sent out on a search and destroy mission. Of course, they have this death list on them. This death list has the names of 70 people. Their first stop, sadly, was the home of Nate Champion. His name had been penciled in at the top of the death list. Now, the regulators and the Pinkertons, claiming that Nate Champion they claim he's the head honcho of the notorious but, totally fictitious Red Sash Gang. They arrive at Champion's cabin in the wee hours of the morning on April 11th, 1892. Now, inside the cabin was not only Nate, but his friend and partner, Nick Ray. Now, as Nick Ray goes outside to chop some more wood for the fire, he is immediately gunned down in cold blood. Champion runs outside to protect his friend. He grabs him, and even with the bullets flowing like rain, he somehow manages to haul Nick back into the safety of the cabin. With Nick dying, Nate, outnumbered 70 to 1, at least 70 to 1, keeps the attackers at bay with a barrage of pistol and rifle fire. But the regulators and Pinkertons have surrounded the cabin, and Nate Champion is trapped with no way out. Champion made them pay. He makes these guys pay for the killing of his friend Nick Ray. He shoots 2 of the attackers dead and wounds a host of others. At least a dozen or so other men are wounded by Champion. Now, Champion realizes that he is doomed. So Nate begins to write his final thoughts in his diary. Nate writes that the bullets are coming like hail and that he feels lonesome as he approaches his own death. Champion signs his name into the diary entry and then rushes out into the cold night, his guns ablazing. Champion never stands a chance, and he is shot down in the night, his body riddled with bullets. Champion is then strung up and used for target practice by the gleeful regulators and Pinkertons. Finally, with hundreds of bullet holes in his body, a warning sign that reads, "Rustlers beware," is pinned to the corpse of Nate Champion. The cold-blooded murder of Nate Champion was the opening salvo, the first barrage in a war of extermination that became known as the Johnson County War. Crossing Champion's name off their list, the regulators and Pinkertons tried to decide who their next victim might be. Now, but unknown to the regulators and the Pinkertons, the Homesteaders are not exactly about to sit around and do nothing and become passive victims of the cattle baron's murderous rage. 200 Johnson County homesteaders pick up their own weapons and chased off the cattle baron's murderous hired guns. The regulators and the Pinkertons take refuge at a ranch near Buffalo, Wyoming, and are ultimately saved at the last minute when the U.S. cavalry comes to their rescue. The local sheriff, Red Angus, who was, sympathetic to the Homesteaders, demands to the Army that, Colonel Canton and his psychos, the Pinkertons and the regulators, be handed over to him. But the Army refuses. The cavalry fears that the regulators would be lynched instantly by the angry Homesteaders. Now, meanwhile, a reporter is poking through the rubble of what had been Nate Champion's cabin and finds Nate's last entry in his diary. He finds the diary. The reporter's name was Asa Mercer. And Mercer writes a book about the Johnson County War called The Banditti of the Plains, or the Cattlemen's Invasion of Wyoming in 1892. Now, in his book, Asa charges that the richest and most powerful cattlemen, of the West were actually responsible for all the brutality and murder of the Johnson County War. He throws the blame where it belongs, on the mega-wealthy cattle barons. Mercer charges that politicians, all the way up to the president, were involved in a conspiracy, and that's the president of the United States, were involved in a conspiracy to drive the Homesteaders from Wyoming. This war of extermination was okayed by the White House, according to Asa Mercer. Now, Mercer's book was systematically suppressed. Copies were burned, and the original printing plates were destroyed. Even the copy in the Library of Congress mysteriously disappeared. A few copies managed to survive, and this book is very, very rare. And if you find a copy, it's worth mega bucks. Now, Asa Mercer was himself jailed. He received endless harassment. He's jailed for sending obscene materials through the mail. The government prosecutes him, claiming that the book is pornography. But as a result of the furor over the book, the powerful cattle barons, the Stockmen Association of Cheyenne, spends years and years trying to conceal their culpability. They claim they're not to blame. They had nothing to do with it. They spend the rest of their lives. They're marked men, and people hiss and boo whenever they walk by. Because of its lasting effect on the development of the American West, Nate Champion's Red Sash Gang became the most powerful gang of outlaws and rustlers that never, ever existed. All right. With that thought, we're going to take another musical break. When we return,